Module 5 is about building infrastructure to support restorative practices with fidelity. So, what needs to be in place? The word restorative has the root restore, and restore assumes something was there but then was damaged or lost. Before we can restore, we need to have something to restore back to. So it is necessary to have strong tier 1 practices in place. Restorative practices range from informal to formal, from preventative to responsive. On a restorative practices continuum, the informal practices include affective statements that communicate people's feelings, affective questions that cause people to reflect on how their behavior has affected others, small impromptu conversations, groups and circles which are somewhat more structured but do not require the elaborate preparation needed for formal conferences. Moving from left to right on the continuum as restorative practices become more formal, they involve more people, require more planning and time, and are more structured and complete. Although a formal restorative process might have dramatic impact, informal practices have a cumulative impact because they are part of everyday life. The aim of restorative practices is to develop community and to manage conflict and tensions by repairing harm and building relationships. This statement identifies both proactive approaches by building relationships and developing community, and reactive approaches by repairing harm and restoring relationships. Organizations that only use the reactive without building the social capital beforehand are less successful than those that also use proactive measures. Multi-tiered systems of support, or MTSS, is a framework for systematically addressing the academic, social, emotional, and behavioral developmental needs of students through the span of their pre-kindergarten through grade 12 education. Restorative practices in the school can be applied in multiple ways using the MTSS framework. Rather than focusing solely on a single student, restorative practices emphasize equally the needs of and support for all members of the school community, including adults. The practices themselves lend to alignment within a three-tiered model of support, such as PBIS. The triangle becomes a clear guide for where these practices can fit, how to think about decisions for when to use them, what percent of the time to utilize more proactive strategies versus reactive strategies, and so on. The Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, often referred to as CASEL, created this graphic, which identifies the 5 core competencies areas for social emotional learning: self-awareness, self-management, responsible decision making, relationship skills, and social awareness. Both SEL and restorative practices are used to systematically and intentionally build equitable learning environments in schools. While delivering their approaches, while differing rather in their approaches, they share many common characteristics. RP and SEL are both used to improve school climate by strengthening student to student, staff to staff, and student to staff relationships. Restorative practices and SEL can be implemented together to improve school or classroom climate, improve attendance and engagement, reduce exclusionary discipline practices such as suspensions, and reduce disproportionality in discipline. Let's examine how SEL and restorative practices are complementary. In the area of self-awareness, we know that a tenet of self-awareness is understanding one's values. Restorative practices emphasizes understanding and practicing ethical values like empathy, compassion, kindness, and respect. In the area of self-management, Restorative practices helps individuals become more aware that his or her disruptive behaviors are the problem, not him or herself, making it easier to manage stress and control impulses. In the area of responsible decision making, restorative practices teaches how to resolve conflict and identify its causes. By examining the full context around conflict, deep understandings necessary to make wise academic and social decisions develops. In the area of relationship skills, restorative practices helps build relationship skills by promoting collaboration and cooperation through empathetic and compassionate interaction between peers and faculty. And then in the area of social awareness, through co-creation of norms, restorative practices establishes understood social norms for interacting with others. The PBIS framework allows us to be systematic. We use data to determine which restorative practices to implement. We teach our staff and students how to utilize those practices. We use data to assess fidelity of implementation. We match intensity of practices to intensity of student need as we layer up the triangle. And we use data to assess outcomes or impact on the identified data points. Practices implemented with PBIS can include restorative practices. When implementing restorative practices, the PBIS framework provides structure. Without the PBIS framework as a mechanism for installation, we risk a lack of ability for replication, lack of complete installation, poor implementation, and therefore potentially poor outcomes. Let's take a closer look at each of these circles individually. First, we'll look at outcomes. The targets for school outcomes are decided at the local level and may include some of the examples shown here. The team may want to increase student and staff attendance, improve academic performance, decrease the number of punitive responses to misbehavior, decrease instances of misbehaviors, and or increase the school climate score. Next, let's look at data. Data are central to all the core features of MTSS. Consider the data that should be collected. There are two categories of data that must be established when implementing restorative practices: punitive discipline data and restorative practices data. Punitive discipline data, such as the rates of in-school suspensions, out-of-school suspensions, expulsions, and referrals to law enforcement, is necessary to show a reduction in exclusionary discipline practices and racial disparities. Restorative practices data, such as who is referring students and for what behavior, can show how restorative practices is being used within the building. Both types of data are critical to troubleshooting areas of concern, celebrating successes, and securing funding. Consideration has to be given to these questions. We know that punitive data are already being collected and analyzed. How will restorative practices data be collected? How are restorative practices data to be analyzed and used in the problem-solving decision-making process? Now, let's consider systems. The systems component of MTSS is about supporting staff in their implementation. As your school considers including restorative practices in the PBIS framework, it is important that appropriate systems are in place. When establishing the structures necessary to support the implementation of restorative practices, it is critical to clearly define the roles of staff members in the process. An ideal behavior team would include the restorative practices coordinator, an administrator, a social emotional representative, such as a social worker or a school psychologist, a special education representative, such as a case manager, an expert in student disabilities and the requirements of IDEA, the school resource officer, a teacher, the nurse, and any other building staff who hold strong, influential relationships with students particularly at-risk youth. Finally, let's talk about practices. Practices are how we interact with and support students. The three-tiered approach to organizing practices is represented by the multi-tiered triangle. Using the multi-tiered approach helps schools integrate their many priorities and practices into a single continuum. This alignment of initiatives is absolutely critical to working efficiently. Restorative practices across the continuum, affective statements, affective questions, small impromptu conversations, circles, and conferences are used to support community members. Practices along the continuum are used as interventions aligned with the level and need. Practices must be implemented with fidelity, and the results must be measured to ensure improved outcomes. Now that we've looked at the framework that can support implementation of restorative practices, let's consider some guiding principles for the work itself. With this assignment, you will review guiding principles that should be in place at your school in order to be able to successfully implement restorative practices. The document provided at the bit.ly link on your screen lists these 7 principles. Under each principle are some of its important implications. Focus on Principle 2, which looks at building systems that address misbehavior and harm in a way that strengthens relationships. Examine your school's discipline policies in terms of the important implications of this principle. What do you think needs to be updated? Pause this recording to complete this assignment. When you're finished, come back to continue with this module.